Question 98 of the Summa Theologia is a very interesting one. It's also very short, just 2 articles, and it's about sex. I mean, there's no other way of getting around it. It's St. Thomas Aquinas asking basically if in the original state of innocence and justice, did Adam and Eve and anybody who else was to live in that state have sexual relations in the ordinary way that we do now, and it would have been different in a sense, but the actual the mechanics of it, I guess you could say, would have been the same. So these are just 2 articles. It's interesting, and it also shows that St. Thomas Aquinas has a great respect for the sexual act, and it's the fact that it's natural, and it would not have been anything bad or not existing in the state of innocence and original justice, because it's something that's very natural to the human being. So I think it's nice to see how St. Thomas Aquinas wrote about this. The first article, he says, whether in the state of innocence generation existed, right? So what was their generation, babies being born and propagation of the human race. He says, in the state of innocence, there would have been generation of offspring for the multiplication of the human race. Otherwise, man's sin would have been very necessary for such a great blessing to be its result, right? We must therefore observe that man by his nature is established, as it were, midway between corruptible and incorruptible creatures. Again, a theme that continues through the Summa. We're an interesting kind of hybrid, right? So our body is corruptible, our soul is incorruptible, and so we're an interesting mix. His soul being naturally incorruptible while his body is naturally corruptible, which I kind of just mentioned. We must also observe that nature's purpose appears to be different as regards corruptible and incorruptible things, for that seems to be the direct purpose of nature, which is invariable and perpetual, while what is only for a time is seemingly not the chief purpose of nature, but as it were subordinate to something else. Otherwise, when it ceased to exist, nature's purpose would become void. So he's saying that even though we have a corruptible body, we are, as persons, supposed to continue on. And so we have this body that's corruptible, but there's also a need for us to continue on. And this is what's going to be the propagation of the species, and through generation of continuing to have all these precious little babies that are born. Therefore, since in things corruptible none is everlasting and permanent except the species, like the brute animals are incorruptible, I guess, in a sense, because they can keep having more babies, right? They can keep having more and more, even though individually they will corrupt. It follows that the chief purpose of nature is the good of the species, for the preservation of which natural generation is ordained. Hence it belongs to man to beget offspring on the part of the naturally corruptible body. But on the part of the soul, which is incorruptible, it is fitting that the multitude of individuals should be the direct purpose of nature, or rather the author of nature, who alone is the creator of the human soul. Wherefore, to provide for the multiplication of the human race, he established the begetting of offspring even in the state of innocence. So God creates souls, but human beings cooperate with God in creating new human beings, at least the bodily part, and then God creates the soul, and voila, we've got new human beings. But he's saying that's how we just keep propagating the species, is to keep having babies. Now, Article 2, whether in the state of innocence there should have been generation by coition. So basically saying, would there have been the sexual act as we know it today back in the state of innocence? And again, I think this is beautiful, because he's saying, yeah, of course there would have been. It's natural. Some of the early doctors, considering the nature of concupiscence as regards generation in our present state, concluded that in the state of innocence generation would not have been affected in the same way. Thus, Gregory of Nyssa says that in paradise the human race would have been multiplied by some other means, as the angels were multiplied without coition by the operation of divine power. So some of them are saying, it's just a kind of a negative view on sexuality, and saying, I don't think so. Not in a state of innocence. It wouldn't have been that way, because look how it is now, right? But Thomas says this is unreasonable, for what is natural to man was neither acquired nor forfeited by sin. Now it is clear that generation by coition is natural to man by reason of his animal life, which he possessed even before sin, just as it is natural to other perfect animals. Thus, as regards generation by coition, there are, in the present state of life, two things to be considered. One, which comes from nature, is the union of man and woman. For in every act of generation there is an active and passive principle. Wherefore, since wherever there is a distinction of sex, the active principle is male and the passive is female, the order of nature demands that for the purpose of generation there should be concurrence of male and female. So he's saying, hey, this is natural, right? This is the way that God created us to keep the species going. So that's the way it is. The second thing to be observed is a certain deformity of excessive concupiscence, which in the state of innocence would not have existed. Okay, there would not have been sin or bad thoughts or concupiscence or lusting after the opposite sex when the lower powers were entirely subject to reason. Okay, that's why there wouldn't have been any of this. Wherefore Augustine says, we must be far from supposing that offspring could not be begotten without concupiscence. All the bodily members would have been equally moved by the will, without ardent or wanton incentive, with calmness of soul and body. So it was different back then. We didn't have concupiscence, we didn't have the effects of original sin, and therefore there would not have been this tendency to sin, this tendency to lust like we have today, which is so evident in our and clear in our culture. Interesting that Augustine was the one that was weighing in on this because of his past life. He, famously said, God, give me chastity, but not yet. So he struggled with this personally. I don't know about Aquinas. We don't have any record of Aquinas having big struggles with lust. There's that one story of him being up in the tower and his brothers put a prostitute up there to tempt him out of his vocation. And he chased her out of the tower with a firebrand, and legend says that that moment he was given the gift of chastity so that he could focus on his writing and not have a lot of concupiscible desires that would distract him, right? Interesting story. So that is going to do it for question 98 of the Summa. Very interesting one. Just 2 articles, very quick. So bottom line is, yes, there would have been generation, and yes, there would have been the sexual act as it is today, but without the hindrance of concupiscence, which resulted from original sin. Thank you for joining me. This is our journey through the Summa, one question at a time, and I appreciate you journeying with me. God bless you, St. Thomas Aquinas. Pray for us.